Good evening. Thank you for joining us for Fresh Ink New Music. Tonight, California Symphony is giving us a first look into the making of Like a Broken Clock. This new composition is by current young American composer-in-residence, Catherine Balch. We'll meet her tonight along with California Symphony music director, Donato Cabrera. Like a Broken Clock will make its world premiere this coming Sunday, May 6, at the Lesher Center for the Arts, and tickets are available for purchase online at californiasymphony.org. Before we begin tonight's program, we also want to mention a new summer education series called Fresh Look, the Symphony Exposed. These adult classes, presented by California Symphony, will be held on Saturdays starting in mid-July. And the Walnut Creek Library Foundation is proud to partner with California Symphony to host these classes at the Walnut Creek Library here in this room, which will be held in English with live Spanish translation. This program is for anyone interested in learning more about classical music, and flyers are available outside. You can pick one up for more information. We'd also like to thank our live program sponsors, the Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, East Bay Times, and Minuteman Press Lafayette. Now, please join me in welcoming the Director of Operations and Education for California Symphony, Sunshine Defner, who will be moderating tonight's discussion.
Thank you very much, Susan. Actually, I will start just by... Thank you very much, Jimmy. I'd like to actually welcome our special guests up to the stage with me already. Our music director, Donato Cabrera, and Catherine Balch, our 2017 to 2020 Young American Composer in Residence.
Good evening, everybody.
So let me just start, of course, again by thanking the Library Foundation, of course, and Susan Moon for hosting California Symphony here at the library for Live from the Library. This is actually our third time participating in Live from the Library and our second year in a row. It's a fantastic series, and we want to use this opportunity to be able to share with the community the music that we bring here. Many of you, of course, I do see very familiar faces here in the audience and some new faces, which is fantastic. But you may all know that California Symphony is a cornerstone arts organization with the Lesher Center for the last 31, we are a 31-year-old organization. And since the inception of the Lesher Center for the Arts 26 years ago, we have been a cornerstone arts organization partner with them. So this community is very important to us. And being an organization here in the San Francisco Bay Area, of course, we have a tremendous wealth of riches in musicians. The musicians that are members of our orchestra play all over the Bay Area, including some of the other big hitters, I will say, San Francisco Opera, the Ballet, and the Symphony, and also play with us. This is one of the items that actually helped us, I think, to be able to attract the tremendous talent of Donato Cabrera in 2014 when we did our search for a new music director. So thank you for joining us and being a part of our family.
So happy to be here. I mean, that whole process of a music director search was, especially here in the Bay Area, was a very exciting time, I think, for the California Symphony. Certainly for me, I was in the middle of my tenure with the San Francisco Symphony at the time, and I remember the very first rehearsal I had as a guest conductor for performances of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, and then as a music director candidate a year later for Prokofiev's Symphony No. 5. I just remember feeling so at ease because I had already had made music for many years with many people in the orchestra. So it was joining a family that I sort of knew already.
Yes, it truly is. And we've been able to, with your leadership, we've performed all over, not just here at the Lesher Center, but also in Livermore and in Oakland and in Napa. And so being able to share that talent all over beyond this community is also really important to us. Donato, I want to talk a little bit more about this because actually since you joined California Symphony, the organization has really seen a tremendous reinvigoration. We have expanded the concert series, we've dramatically increased ticket sales, and we've really engaged with a lot more innovative programming as a part of that leadership. New music, one of which we'll talk with Catherine Balch today. Can you talk a little bit about that search, though, in engaging with new music and innovative programming? The search for the young American composer in residence is kind of a massive undertaking. And this last time, we actually had more than doubled the applicant pool, which meant we had 131 applicants to the Young American Composer in Residence program, which meant 333 musical submissions. How do you tackle a project like that?
How could I have forgotten how many scores? Well, I think one of the wonderful things about the California Symphony one of the many things about the California Symphony that was so wonderful was it had always had a tradition of working with young artists as performers and as composers. The Young American Composer in Residence has been going on for almost the entirety of the California Symphony's existence, and for me, that was one of the exciting attractions to this orchestra, was that while it is a regional orchestra, it was doing all of the things that a major symphony orchestra does, which is to support up-and-coming talent and to support up-and-coming music. And so for me, it was just a matter of really, when I became music director, of reinvigorating that, in a sense, by reminding all of the constituents of the California Symphony that these are the things that make the California Symphony so special, aside from the fact that it's such a great orchestra. But it's really what we program and what we do as an organization that define us. And now that a year after I became music director, Aubrey Bergauer came in as our executive director, we share the same vision for what an orchestra can be within the community. Here within the community, and also at large within the community of music makers, or not just in the country but around the world. With this, the process that we eventually chose, through which we eventually chose Katie, part of it had to do with the fact that we transitioned from requiring scores. The process, it used to be everyone had to actually send in 3 scores plus various CDs of their work, and that was already in 2016.
It was in 2016
when we did the
process.
That was so outdated. So it made it so much easier for composers like Katie to just have it all online, the ease through which the application procedure, that was one thing. And the other thing too was that I think we did a much better job at getting the word out. We were better. We're better at getting the word out for everything that we do, and one of which was, of course, the application procedure for the composer in residence.
And also part of that process was requiring that the candidates, when they submitted their work, everything, even their resume, was completely redacted, which helped us to remove any unintentional bias. We don't know who you are or necessarily who you're connected to, but we are looking, and I say we meaning Donato, is looking strictly at the music.
Initially, we wanted the process to be redacted at the first stages, because, as you said, it's not just unintentional bias. You know, you see a resume, and in our very small world, you see, student composer X has studied with this preeminent composer Y, so therefore they must be better than student composer X has studied at, you know, the University of Northern South Dakota in Hoople, you know. PDQ Bach reference, guys, come on. And so I wanted to get that out of the picture. I wasn't neither was the panel that we chose. We wanted to get that out of the picture entirely. Really, the references of who people studied with. We weren't interested in that. And then as we finished the first round, I decided that let's just keep it that way, and not know who it was that we were, the name of the person and the resume that we were looking at. In fact, we didn't even look at the resume. We simply looked at this music, and through that process, we chose Katie.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly the segue. Exactly. So yes, through all of that, we chose Katie, and the music. Again, talking about this innovative sound. Katie, can you tell us just quickly what pieces? Can you talk a little bit about the pieces that you submitted that kind of ended up? What is it that actually ended up speaking to us, and where did those generate from?
Did I submit? Well,
Leaf was one of them.
Leaf catalog, yeah. So I definitely submitted two pieces that have to do with leaves. Leaf catalog and new geometry were two large ensemble pieces I had, and for the past couple years, I'm kind of finally growing out of this phase. But I've been really attracted to the sort of visual metaphor of the venation pattern of leaves, these sort of arborescences that are self-similar but replicate, starting from a very simple pattern into something that's very rich and complex. And I sort of became attracted to that idea because I saw a play by Tom Stoppard called Arcadia. Do any of you know that play? Oh gosh, it's become one of my favorite pieces of literature theater of all time. And in that play, there's a young girl named Thomasina Coverley, who it's sort of set in romantic, early 19th century England. She wants so badly to understand this intricate, delicate design of an apple leaf that she discovers for herself a mathematical proof that is the sort of rudimentary form of fractal geometry. And I always loved this character and her sort of incredible drive to understand the beautiful and take it apart and dissect it. And that's sort of that was certainly a metaphor that I was working with in my music, in both Leaf Catalog, which was for orchestra, and in New Geometry, which was for a large chamber ensemble. And the title New Geometry actually is what Thomasina Coverley just calls her mathematical proof. She says in the play that she's discovered a new geometry of irregular forms. So.
Thank you, Katie. Actually, Donato, I do want to hear what was your response to that in actually hearing those things. Just really quickly, though, I keep hearing this coming across when Katie talks about her work. She talks about really that the layers and the dissection of concepts. And I see that come through in the music, and we can come back to that. But Donato, what was your kind of response to those elements that she brought forward in her submissions, and that storytelling and that finesse that she has?
For me, it wasn't about the process through which, because when you get the score, you see notes and you wonder, okay, how are they put together? For me, I'm what I always am trying to look for is a new voice, something that I haven't necessarily, I can't think I've heard before. Like, oh, that combination of instruments, I've never quite heard it done quite like that. Something that catches my attention that is new, a new way of looking at making music, and that's what attracted me to Katie's music, and learning about how the compositional process, her compositional process only added to my appeal. But for me, it was merely the way she composed, and then the recordings of how these sounds worked. And that was what attracted me. I have a question for you. You apply. You're applying for various summer programs and things all the time. What is that like for you? And what was this, if any, if anything you can remember in particular? What was the process for applying for the California Symphonies program like for you, from your end?
I apply to things all the time as a young artist, and I, get 10 times as many rejections as I do acceptances. But there are certain applications that I put a lot of care into, and this was certainly one. In part, I don't know, Sunshine, did you get, I think I forwarded you and Teresa the cover letter I wrote in 2012 or 2013 when I applied for the first time to the California Young Composer in Residence.
Yes, actually, I did I actually ran some data on how many composers have applied more than once, and we actually had a good pool of candidates who have applied to this program over and over again. Most recently, I think it was 3 times people is the average that people will actually reapply to this program. They're looking to become engaged with this.
Yeah.
And for you, what is that reason, this particular program?
I mean, the reason is, it seems obvious to say, but there's just no other program in the country where composers can establish an actual long-term relationship with a community of musicians and an ensemble of people, and by that I mean not just the players, but also the amazing administration, and to be invited into that community and be invested in by that community and feel like you can also give something back. There's just, it's just not, it doesn't exist except for this program, and I think that's why so many composers, it's something that's sort of on their radar for a long time. I think when I applied, I was like 19, and I had written, I don't think I'd even written an orchestra piece yet.
The first time you
But the
applied.
first time, yes. And so I was a little on the young end for that, but.
Yes, and what was that? What is that experience for you in other commissions and other programs that you work with?
So I'm very fortunate to have gotten several wonderful opportunities to work with professional orchestras. I worked with internationally with the Tokyo Symphony Orchestra, and also in the States with Albany and Minnesota. And it's always a thrill to have your music realized by such intensely dedicated musicians. But the rehearsal process is fast, and time is money, and there isn't really time in those types of settings when you're dealing with lots of people and just lots of resources to get your hands dirty and figure out what works and what doesn't. And so the process of writing orchestra pieces for me, really up till my experience with the workshop in January, has been, okay, I'll write the piece and figure out what I need to fix later. Because you can't fix anything in the rehearsal process, so you sort of learn, retrospectively in those settings. And that's an incredibly valuable experience for a young artist. But even more amazing is the fact that the orchestra and Donato in January read through a draft of my piece. And I got to make some of those decisions and edits and refining before the actual premiere, which is that just never happens with an orchestra. So that was very exciting.
Just for those of you who aren't aware of the time is money part of the situation, a professional orchestra for any given concert will rehearse usually at most 4 times. And it's just days before the performance. So for instance, if a performance happens on Saturday, the rehearsals usually begin on Wednesday or Thursday, or maybe just the 2 days before. So the time is very limited. 4 rehearsals, and they have to come prepared at the first rehearsal. And normally, if it's a new piece, or if it's a piece that's say 10 minutes long, even if it's a new piece with a major symphony orchestra, this piece would at most have a half an hour on one rehearsal, and at most a half an hour on another rehearsal, and that's it. That is it. So a total of 60 minutes maybe for a brand new piece of, and that's actually
That takes,
generous.
like 4 to 6 months to write.
So there's literally, even though it's a new piece of music, what she's saying is absolutely true. So there's no time for experimentation. There's no time to think, oh, maybe that could be a little bit different. It's done. The performance happens, and then if the composer is lucky, there might be a second, third, or fourth performance of a new piece. Usually, it's questionable if that even happens. And so and it's also, if she wants to make any changes, that costs money too. You can't just write it in. There has to be the new parts need to be made, and that's usually a couple of $1,000s to change the parts. So it's a very intense. Very little room for error, and so what she's talking about in terms of our program is we give them a chance. Now it's not all that much time; it's about 30 minutes, but it's 30 minutes to experiment.
And I was actually shocked. I mean, to be honest, I totally came into the process thinking like, oh, that's nice, they'll read through my piece. But I was shocked listening to the recording, because they record this 30 minutes for me to use as a sort of archival resource as I go back and revise or work on finishing the piece. I was shocked how helpful it was. Just to clarify, so much of composing is trying to match your inner ear, what's in your brain, to something outside that can be notated. And that process is very hard sometimes, and you also just get so in your head that having a physical sort of copy of an ensemble working that through, I was so elated to have that recording, and so surprised to see how helpful it was as I continued working on the piece, even just half an hour. It's great.
Great. So just a little bit more on the collaboration, and I really want to dig into the program itself and how this all ties into this particular piece. But just lastly on the collaboration process, Katie, you live on the East Coast. That's a long ways away, and you are the young American composer in residence, which means, as we just said, California Symphony brings her out in January for a workshop, and now again for the premiere. But in the interim, are you left all alone in this process, or how does Donato and the California Symphony engage you through this process as well? And Donato, your thoughts on that in engaging with her in that collaboration as well?
So Donato and Marcella, the orchestral librarian, have been wonderful resources. Basically, I can reach out to them whenever I have questions. And Marcella especially has been a wonderful person to communicate with, just about formatting and layout of parts, making sure everything's very legible, and clarifying any questions I have about the instrumentation or the amount of players, things like that. So correspondence is always easy in this age of the internet, and we have a lot of phone conversations. We do, we sort of have check-ins, artistic meeting check-ins a few times throughout the years, the way it's been. And I'm not all alone in New York. I'm doing a doctorate at Columbia University, so I have a private teacher there who I can ostensibly get feedback on my music about. Yeah.
From my point of view, really the relationship between the composer and the conductor really goes from 0 to 60 in 6 seconds, because she needs time, the composer needs time to compose the work, and I'm sure she has my email, my phone. I'm welcome to answer any questions that I might be able to answer. But really, our collaboration happens in the moment during the rehearsal process. And I've purposely created a program where the rehearsal process this week will allow us to have enough time to get this work on its legs.
Just an example of that, we were just having coffee before this, and Donato was asking about a certain articulation for a muted sound in the horns, and he asked, do you want that muted with the hand or with a mute? And that was something I hadn't even thought of. I sort of just assumed that they would use their hands for a certain poppy muted quality. And Donato, having such deep expertise and being so embedded in the orchestral sound world, is able to come up with observations like that can really fine-tune the piece and make a big difference, these little details. And that's also how I develop my inner ear as a composer. So the next time I go to write a piece, I know, like, oh, Donato, demonstrated for me these two ways a horn can be muted, and now I understand that that's a slightly different sound, and I might use that more consciously.
It's also one of the, Katie talked about this a little bit, it's developing one-on-one relationships with musicians in an orchestra, where often a young composer, any composer that is brought in is commission a new piece, the time is so limited, and there's no time to say hello, to ask any questions of any orchestra musician. It's almost not forbidden, but there's just no time for that to happen usually. And so what you do is you said this earlier, you ask your friends who play various instruments for some advice perhaps, but here you've already had quite a bit of interaction with specific members of the orchestra who know that they can come up to Katie and say this or that and give some, perhaps some advice or some insight into how they would like the music to be written, or what they can do with it.
Yeah, and I think just the value of a human face to associate with a bunch of notes and a name on a page is huge. And same with, when I am looking at a giant group of people on stage, being able to know the individuals and basically just get that everyone's a human and we're all just trying to be human, I think just makes the rehearsal process much more pleasurable and fulfilling.
This is great. I wanted to also. This is a large part of California Symphony. Donato, one of your other major, probably your most major responsibility with the California Symphony is programming the season. When you look at innovation and new music, first, can you actually define new music for us? How do you then curate that into a program like the Sundays concert, where we have big Brahms, right? And we have new music. What goes into the process of curating a program that is going to be consumable?
Well, programming at various times of the year will keep me up at night. The programming, the way it works with the California Symphony is a very healthy one. Aubrey and I meet for a couple of hours in the fall at some point, and to talk about programming for the next year. And we already have a running wish list of pieces that both of us have wanted to program, and over the course of that lunch we come up with a season, and we think it looks pretty damn good, and then we hand it over to you, and you start putting the numbers together, and we realize, oh, we might need to change this or that because this is maybe a little more over the budget that we currently have, or there are various factors, and so it goes through a few iterations, and a few months later, then we have a season. But it does take time, and it does take a lot of thought for this program, for instance, there are a lot of new things. All three pieces, in fact, are new to the California Symphony. All three pieces have never been performed in that sense. We've never performed Sibelius' Third Symphony for the Walnut Creek audience. The second piano concerto by Brahms has also never been performed. So the entire concert is actually new music in terms of having of number of performances. It's also new in the sense that normally you have an overture, concerto, intermission, big symphony. Well, the Sibelius Symphony Number 3 is only a 30-minute piece. It's a very condensed symphony. And conversely, the Brahms' Second Piano Concerto is really more like a symphony with a piano part, a very difficult piano part, but the scope of the symphony, it's a 47-minute long concerto, and it's completely symphonic in nature. So what we have here is it's also a new format, new-ish format. So we begin with we have a brand new piece, Katie's piece, then we do the Sibelius Symphony because it's shorter, intermission, the piano concerto is on the second half. So in that sense, it's also new because it's not the typical format of a symphonic concert. So when I'm programming, I'm not only thinking about exposing new music in the sense of a piece, and I tend to not like to use the word new or contemporary. I like to showcase a piece by a living composer. I also love to showcase a piece by a composer that we all know and love, and also usually do a concerto, but have maybe a performance by an up-and-coming soloist, which is also what we have. We have Hao Chen-Zhang returning. He's still young and fresh and
still new.
And still new, but there are so many avenues that one can take when programming a symphonic concert. Yes, we all love the symphonies of Beethoven, and we all love the symphonies of Tchaikovsky, and we all love the pieces that we love, right? And we're comforted by that. But there's so much other wonderful music out there that we may not know. Like, I would imagine a lot of us have heard Sibelius' Second Symphony. It's the most performed symphony of Sibelius. But he wrote, not much long after the Second Symphony and the incredible success that he had, he wrote this lovely little Third Symphony that's not performed as often. It's every bit as grand and lovely as the Second Symphony, so let's go out and hear this piece. And then, and by the way, why not have a concerto on the second half when it demands it? So I think a concert should be many things. Should be comforting, but it should also stretch the imagination and have all of us on stage and in the audience sitting forward, in thinking about what might happen next.
Great. So I want to talk more about Like a Broken Clock, which is the title of Catherine's new work that will premiere on Sunday. Like a Broken Clock is all lowercase letters. We've seen that before in the way that composers title their pieces. But can you, in that vein, can you give us a little bit more insight into your inspiration and how you approached this piece and where that comes from? So,
I am a student of David Lang, who titles many of his pieces in all lowercase, but that's not why this piece is all lowercase. Sometimes I title pieces in lowercase when I feel like they're a continuation of something, an idea I'm already sort of working on or working through. And in this case, for the past, kind of like the leaves, I tend to get obsessed with certain ideas or sounds and try to reproduce them in a lot of my music in a variety of ways. And with this piece, lately I've been obsessed with sort of trying to capture an off-kilter ticking or pulsing that I sort of liken to when you bounce a bouncy ball and it sort of has that exponential decay, like bum, 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 bum. I just love that sound, and I really want to figure out how to do that.
So does this kind of go back to that deconstructing concepts
so.
and sounds and placing that back into musicality?
Yeah. So in this piece, I take inspiration from a Joanna Newsom lyric. Joanna Newsom's a harpist and songwriter who's very amazing. And she has a lyric in her song "In California," which I thought was appropriate for the California Symphony. That goes like a broken clock that trembles on the edge of or like a little clock, that trembles on the edge of an hour. And I really liked that image of a little trembling clock, and I thought that fit with my sort of obsession with bouncing sounds. And so I take my title from her lyric, and that's in part why it's all lowercase. I replaced trembling with broken, because in my piece, this clock sort of breaks down and reassembles itself. And so it's in lowercase in part to reflect that it's a fragment from this lyric that I think is really poetic, and also to reflect that it's part of a continuation of my process. This piece is one way of manifesting or exploring a sound I'm currently interested in and trying to figure out how to express in a variety of different ways.
So your process, again, I want to pull this up, actually. Here we are. I'm going to pull up, pull that and that. This, I think, is one of the most interesting things I've ever seen. This looks nothing like music and everything like music. Okay, so side note, guilty pleasure. I watched this television show where this musician has a major accident that causes him amnesia, and in order to get back into his music, he starts doing therapy painting, and then that therapy painting starts turning into a whole new composition, and he takes that painting into the studio and has the musicians play the painting, which that is something that I thought of immediately when I saw this. It's the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. Can you explain to us in somewhat simple or complicated terms what this really is?
I think often before I start committing notes to the page, I try to imagine the piece as a whole in my head. And I have like several techniques for doing that. I learned from a teacher. I use timers a lot to sort of time my thought process and figure out how things are moving through time by like actually timing myself think. And I sort of do a lot of exercises of internally audiating the piece before I start writing, to try to just get a sense of the overall shape, because I tend to, as you probably can guess, get very nitpicky about details. So going into the composition process with some sense of overall architecture is very useful for me, because I tend to start micromanaging very quickly. And usually the way I make a sort of shorthand for this process of internal audiation is with drawing. So I draw a lot, especially in the beginning of my process, and I try to draw a sort of formal outline or shape. And this is pretty like a linear sort of, it's like a teleological map of the piece that really is just a shorthand for myself when I start writing notes down. It helps me sort of remember the sounds I'm trying to imagine and reproduce on paper.
We have a clicker pointer here if you wanted to point any of this out, but is there, maybe I'll point it out. So looking at this from a linear perspective, starting here and then ending, what is all of this down here? Is this a different section? Are these winds and brass, and these are strings over here? How does this all...
So I think you'll hear, like if you come to the concert on Sunday, which you should, you'll hear in the beginning of the piece a sort of slow, very breathy, sustained introduction that is sort of interrupted or accumulates into these big, what I call in the score, bell tolls and resonance. So these big, like bang, 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 like a grandfather clock. And that's sort of what those big lines there sort of represent in my brain. And later in the piece, there's sort of a long section that Donato and I were just talking about, the woodwind part, where the woodwinds are sort of, you'll hear this sort of texture of woodwinds sort of playfully dancing off kilter. And that's sort of that's this part here, Sunshine, that you were talking about. Yeah. So that the reason it sort of happens as like a secondary stream is I consider that emergence of that woodwind sort of dance. It starts in the strings in this sort of pizzicati material and eventually kind of gives way or fades into that. So it's all just a shorthand. It's all just a shorthand to try to keep track what's in my head.
And what does it become? What does it look like when it's done?
Like notes. Like notes on, we got notes on a 5-line staff.
Now,
sometimes.
I will say that composers through the last 50 years have explored different types of notation than notes on the page.
Yeah.
And have given orchestras something that looks like this, and there's actually
I'm like
very
way too much of a control freak to ever do that.
but there is something to be said for thinking outside of what musicians get so as we all do with whatever walk of life we're in, we get so obsessed with the specific way of expressing or of the process, and it's actually a great exercise for musicians to have something like this given to them on a stand and express that, if nothing else, just for sheer variety.
Yeah.
But that's not how we all have been given. This has been turned into, if you read music, quarter notes, eighth notes, and so forth, and key signatures and what have you.
Yeah. Certainly, when I teach, I often encourage my students to make sort of graphic scores like this and improvise to them either collaboratively or on their own. And I think we're so visual that I think actually we can learn a lot from the way we can learn a lot orally from the way we visually represent music, aside from the symbols of the 5-line staff. So certainly it's an exercise I do myself, improvising through visual metaphors or shapes, and something I ask my students to do all the time. Yeah.
That's great. Actually, this is really good because for as little and as much as I know, there does appear to be a lot of improvisation happening in contemporary or new music. I'll use the word. You don't have to.
Okay.
And I imagine that's a real challenge for especially the really large orchestras, 70, 80, 100 orchestra members. Is that something that you do ever employ in your compositions? And I'd love to get feedback from both of you on what you think of improv in large orchestras and how that can actually work successfully.
So I think every musician should be an improviser and a composer. I don't think there's any reason why a performing musician should not be engaged in a sort of creative discourse with his or her work. So I think improvisation and composition is vital to being a person making music. One of the reasons I compose, though, is because I love details, and I express myself through details. And one of the greatest ways of doing that is with an ensemble like the orchestra, where I can just really put a microscope on the fine details of sound and sonic combinations. So for my own music, at this stage with orchestra writing, it's not something I am as interested in but certainly, like, for example, I just had a piece performed by the International Contemporary Ensemble that was called Three Musical Games, and the first movement was Mad Libs, and the second movement was Scrabble, and the third movement was a maze. And that is a graphic, those scores are more graphic, where it's sort of, I have a set of instructions and almost like a musical board game that the players have to follow and make decisions about. And that was for a quartet of musicians, so a much smaller ensemble, also my friends, people I knew I could collaborate closely with on that process, and that certainly involved a much greater degree of input and improvisation, or pre-planning, sort of compositional input from the performers that were actually doing the piece.
With so many things, and music is one of them, specialization has been a wonderful blessing and a curse. In the 18th century, if you played an instrument, you composed, you sang as a child, it was all one thing. Now, most of those compositions we don't know, but if you had met anyone who played in an orchestra in Vienna in the 18th century, they had all taken composition to a very high level. You would have not just learned to play an instrument. You would have done all of the things that music was about. And in the 18th century, improvisation was integral. Everyone improvised. It was just like jazz musicians in the United States in the 20th century. So we all hear about Mozart being an improviser, but everyone could improvise to a certain level, give or take. And as specialization, as people became very good at the violin, that took more time. So there was less time given to learning how to compose, less time learning how to improvise, because everything became more and more. You needed to get just very good on one thing. And so what we all sort of wish we could do, I wish I could sit down at the piano and sound like Art Tatum, but I don't do that because I am a specialized conductor that conducts a symphony orchestra, and that's a very, very unique thing. And so this idea of improvisation seems completely foreign to a classical musician in today's world, but it really shouldn't be. And in a symphony orchestra, there are usually a few folks that are very good at improvising. In the San Francisco Symphony, for instance, the principal trumpet, Mark Inouye, is one of the great jazz trumpet players in the world. And so there are numerous pieces that he would do something it was just his own way. A perfect example is symphonic dances from West Side Story. There are a lot of jazzy things in West Side Story. When he plays symphonic dances, he does it different every time, and it's also in the style of a jazz trumpet player from the 30s or 40s New York City jazz band. Better than anyone I've ever heard. It's just really remarkable. So to utilize someone's talent like Mark's is crucial, and we also have that in the California Symphony.
That's great.
But in this piece, there's
No improvisation.
no improvisation.
Not employed.
But you do give what I do. There are moments where you ask individual members in a string section to
Yes.
do their own thing.
Yeah.
And to not do exactly what this person sitting right next to you is doing.
Right.
Which can be a challenge at first, because you're, as a string player, if you're sitting in the back of the first violins, your whole life you're taught to be right in exactly the same part of the bow as everyone else. And so it's actually rather refreshing to have a piece of music where you're encouraged to not be with your neighbor.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good clarification, and I'm interested to know, is that what we should be listening for, or what should we be listening for in this
Oh
piece?
gosh. I have no idea what you should be listening for. I suppose every time I listen to a piece of new music, maybe I'll just say what I listen for when I listen to a piece of new music. I listen for, I can't help but make some sort of story, even if the piece doesn't have a narrative. I can't help but imagine some sort of narrative or dialogue or conversation between the instruments. I like to listen for color, musical color. So I like to listen for sounds that surprise me and feel really magical. Like, oh, where'd that come from? I love it when I listen to music and I can't tell who's making what sound exactly. And I think I also listen for, I think I'm a really playful person and composer, and so I think I also listen for, I also am attracted to musical moments that feel playful. So I don't know, maybe you'll hear those things in my piece, and maybe you'll hear something totally different. I would be so curious to hear what you hear.
For me, whenever I hear a new piece, conducting a new piece is a totally different process. But in the end, the both of them, what I always feel is that I want to, I hope to hear it again or to perform it again, because just like with a Tchaikovsky symphony or a Beethoven overture or Mozart piano concerto, when you hear something for the first time, that's just the beginning of your relationship with that piece of music for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. And now when I conduct a symphony for the third, fourth, or fifth time, I am discovering something new. Always. And it's because I'm older, I've had different life experiences. The group of musicians I'm conducting is an entirely different group of musicians. It's summer outside or it's raining out, it's entirely different. And so all I know is that this will be with me for the rest of my life, and it's the first page of my relationship with this piece, and I can't wait to hear it again and to do it again, because I'll then learn something new about myself and learn something new about the piece in the subsequent relationships I will have with it. So when I hear, I try my best to keep from even asking the question, do I like it or don't I like it? It's almost superfluous whether I like it or don't like it. I mean, how could I ever say, well, I don't like that. I don't like Brussels sprouts. Because when I was 6, I didn't like Brussels sprouts. That's what you're basically saying when you hear a piece for the first time. It's sort of silly.
So you can't not like my piece.
So for me, liking or disliking a work of art is just not the question. It's the question is, what's my relationship to this piece now, and what will it be in the future?
That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect, and I appreciate those responses too, because I think we've all had a first experience with symphony or orchestra or music at all, and that first experience, you'll remember it, and when you're not used to it, knowing how to approach it is going to help define how you consume music going forward. And for me, it was actually at San Francisco Symphony as a 4th grader, right, at the family concerts, and the conductor actually did an exercise with the entire auditorium of students where he did exactly that, creating a story for yourself in your head when you're hearing these sounds. What does that sound like? Start with, I'll give you one image. He says, start with a frog next to a stream of water. That's it. That's all I'm giving you. Now let the music take you the rest of the way. And so, you know, being able to identify some way to connect to the music is really helpful, so thank you for that. Finally, and we'll wrap up because I'd love to take some questions, but we've already announced this is one of 3 commissions that Katie will do with California Symphony, and we've announced the second one in our 1718 subscription package, which will premiere in May of 2019. So Katie, you don't have to tell us all about the piece because I'm sure it's not fully written yet. However, what's that sample? What can you tell us? And you can even just tell us who the solo instrument is.
So I am so excited that an incredible young violinist named Robin Bollinger is going to be the soloist. She was an Annenberg Fellow this year. She also happens to be my best friend. And she is someone I've known for many years and have had a deep friendship and musical collaboration with for many years, and we'll definitely be wearing matching outfits. But I am so excited to write a piece for her that actually is going to be loosely based off of a solo violin piece I already wrote. I could play like 30 seconds of it. Is there time?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll play for you a little bit of, first of all, I want the piece to be, I haven't written it yet. The piece is going to be very loosely modeled after Ligeti's violin concerto, and if you know Georgi Ligeti's violin concerto, it's very whimsical and crazy and beautiful. It features ocarinas in the instruments. I won't make you guys hire ocarina players.
Usually the woodwind section plays the ocarina.
Yeah. Oh, sweet. But it's unusual in its structure because it's 5 movements. And so I also want to use a 5-movement structure. And I'll play you a little bit of what the sort of either center movement, I'm not sure yet, will be based on. So my computer's down here, I'm not disappearing. Let's see. It's very quiet. So that's a little tiny shimmery.
So I haven't heard that before. So my impression is very similar in that you just tell me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that you're interested in creating. Yes, they're the pitch that they're holding, but it's all the other resultant
Yeah.
qualities that are the sort of the shadows
Yeah.
of that are around that note
Yeah.
that you're also interested in.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, the way that works notationally or like physically on the instrument is the violinist is fingering a natural harmonic, and then on one string, and then on another string trilling between two other natural harmonics. So there's a sort of sustained high frequency or higher pitch, and then around that notes are trilling, sort of creating a little shimmery pattern around that sustained pitch. So I think that would sound really cool if, like, you know, the orchestra was like sustaining those notes and sort of becoming a giant resonating body for the violin, since that sound is so, as you can hear, very delicate and fragile. So
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you both for being here. I'd actually love to take some questions. Does anyone did I cover everything? I don't think I did.
I'll ask a question of Katie. I think people have asked this question before here and elsewhere. If you were to just mention some musical influences that were important to you along the way, they may not even be influences now, but maybe at one point were incredibly important to you.
yeah.
And then not just in the classical music world, but maybe other musics.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I ended up in this genre we call concert music or classical music was really because of the great jazz pianists like Keith Jarrett and Bill Evans and Wynton Marsalis. Those pianists were hugely inspirational to me when I was in high school, and they were all very serious classical improvisers too. Keith Jarrett's Current Concert series is one of my favorite live recordings. And there are many songwriters that I love: Joanna Newsom, Sarah Jarosz, Fiona Apple. Lots of songwriters that I listened to in high school that I really loved, and then of course there's so many contemporary composers that I love. The old dead composers I really love, if you want to know, are Schubert and Beethoven. Every time I listen to a piece of Schubert, I'm like, how did you know that I was going to be alive 200 years from now and you like would write that for me? Thank you. That was so nice of you. Like, so, yeah, does that sort of answer your question?
Great. Yes, Carol.
I have a question along that line. When did you wake up and decide, I want to be a composer? And you mentioned you're working on your PhD at Columbia. Tell us a little bit more about your background, because I think you're incredible. And I want to know how you got there so quickly.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So Carol is asking how you how you got to choosing to compose. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's I think I'm making that decision every day. I think I am so excited about things generally, and there are so many things to be interested in. And it just so happens for some reason, and I'm not really sure why, that the way I explore and express my sort of perception of or taking in of the world around me is through music. And I'm not really sure why that is. But I mean, to be honest with you, my undergraduate was a double degree in composition at New England Conservatory and history and political science at Tufts. And for much of my undergrad, I was expecting to pursue a doctorate in political theory. And it wasn't until very late in my degree where I sort of decided, okay, well, maybe I can do this composing thing, and that can be my vehicle of expression full time, as it were. but I think as musicians, I think it's important to ask yourself, maybe not every day because that would be fatiguing, but every so often, why? Like, why are you doing this? This is, and it's not necessarily a question you can answer, but it's a question you should be asking.
Yes.
Well, along those same lines, I'm curious just how you started as a musician. Did you grow up playing a particular instrument? Did you sing?
Yeah.
So the nuts and bolts background I'm curious about.
So again, the nuts and bolts background, how did you get into music? What
Yeah.
was your first foray?
So I was trained as a pianist. I started getting very serious about piano in middle school. That's when I started putting in the 4 hours a day. Until then, I did a lot of singer-songwriting stuff at the time. I always liked to improvise and be creative on my instrument. But it wasn't until middle school, high school that I started seriously practicing. Honestly, I'm not sure what the trigger was that made me. For a lot of high school, I was actually dating a guy who was a very serious jazz pianist, and I think that definitely upped my desire to, being in love is the best way to learn something. It's like the best way to learn anything is like fall in love with someone that does it. But I'm not sure. I had an amazing piano teacher, Russian woman, Svetlana Pikus. And I sang, but there was certainly a switch at some point where I decided to get really serious about performance practice. So.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. I want to just close by, of course, reminding you that if you've not yet gotten your tickets, you'll get to see this incredible hear this incredible piece this weekend on Saturday. One performance only at the at the Lesher Center for the Arts. But I wanted to also make sure that you all know, I want to talk a little bit more about Fresh Ink. These library talk series that we've started doing in the last year and a half, is all a part of our effort to reinvigorate adult education. We have an incredible youth education program, intensive education in an underserved community, but we want to make sure that our adult audiences and would-be audiences are also engaging with the music on a deeper level. When you know and educate yourself and learn more about something ahead of going to the symphony or the ballet or the opera or the theater or anything else, you're much more likely to enjoy it, and we want you to enjoy it, and we want you to have that opportunity. So this library talk today is actually a part of that series. We're also now going to start this summer. We've been granted an opportunity to start a new program called Fresh Look, the Symphony Exposed, where we're actually going to go even more basic and deeper in a fun way that's going to help you to ask some of those questions that are seemingly simple, but maybe not. What does the conductor do? Does anybody know what the conductor does? Does he just stand up there and wave a baton around? There's more to it than that. And we're going to start to answer some of these questions in a 4-part series, 4 weeks every Saturday from July 14th to August 4th, and help all of us understand
How
just a
many
little
of
bit
you
more.
have been to pre-concert lectures at San Francisco Symphony? Okay, so Scott Fogelsong does those lectures. So he's one of a few. He'll be the leader for these lectures here. So he's a beloved Bay Area fixture and such he's so fun and leading, and he'll be leading those here.
So we hope you'll join us. That was my last comment. I just want to say thank you again to everybody for being here, and thank you to our guests, and thank you to the library.
Thank you, Sunshine.